Following the review of the relatively low-end by Thermaltake's Level 20 standards, Level 20 MT, we're now looking at the $250 A500, and that would be this case here. So at $250, it's priced at around the same price point as the Cooler Master H500M, which comes in both a mesh or glass panel option. It includes both in the box, and also the Dark Base Pro 900, a highly regarded case that does well in both thermal and acoustic scenarios. So it's got really fierce competition. This price point, it's not as empty as it used to be. Phanteks, for example, the Evolv X, a popular case this year, is about $200 if you're not factoring in the Mini ITX accompaniment. So the A500 has a tough fight ahead of it, and today we're gonna be looking at the thermals, the acoustics, and the build quality of Thermaltake's new $250 flagship. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the GN Store. One of the best ways to support us and get something in return is to grab an item from the GN Store, like one of our blue beer glasses with a gold halo featuring the popular Teardown logo, or one of our critically acclaimed mod mats with wiring diagrams and a GPU teardown grid. We also have a brand new black and blue mouse pad that many of you requested, now available on the store. We keep selling out of things thanks to you all, but we've been working hard to get it back in stock. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab something today. This case does some interesting things. It does some really minor stuff incredibly well, and it does some kind of major stuff not that great. And an example of the really small attention to detail in this case that we did like would be, for example, the way this panel mounts. And when we go over the build notes, we'll show you in more detail. But it has uneven hinge pins, which is a good thing. They're not symmetrical at the top and the bottom, and that makes it easier to just remove this panel by doing that, and then when you mount it, it's extremely easy to line it back up, something that can't be said for all types of panels that mount in this fashion. So really small stuff like that, Thermaltake's done well. Another example, also on the side panel, would be there's no bolt or any kind of structural reinforcement on the right side to hold the panel flush to the case, and instead they're using magnets, which isn't that innovative, but in addition to that, the panel does not sag at all, and it's a giant piece of thick glass. So they've done well to keep everything really flush without going crazy by having a bunch of mounting hardware that looks ugly, costs more money, and if you design around it, which they did, you don't need. So job well done there on that small detail. There is this hinge, but you don't need it. It does mount just fine without it. So overall, externally, the case looks not bad. If you look at the front panel, you might write it off instantly because it is a closed off front, but we've seen this design work actually not bad in previous Thermaltake cases like the View 71. The question is, will it work well today? Because the View 71, we went into that review thinking it would be a horrible thermal performer, and it actually came out pretty okay. It was in the top half of the results at the time, which is damn good for a case that had, I think, 2 fans in it. And it was just one on the bottom, one on the top, and that was it, and it worked fine because the rest of the case was designed around that, and it didn't really need to brute force the cooling solution. For this one, there is a pretty wide gap here. It's a little over an inch maybe, but only part of it is perforated because the rest of it is filled with, I think that's steel. Pretty sure it's just stamped out steel behind the aluminum paneling. So there's not as much breathing space as it might look like from a profile shot, which is unfortunate. And also the fan positioning, more importantly, is just kind of odd by default. Now, this is something you can easily fix, so that's good, but they've positioned 2 fans in here, and one of them is in the center, as you'll see there, and the other one is in the bottom. The question that I would ask you is, what does that do? What is the fan down here doing? Because there's a power supply shroud, like in most modern cases. So you're really only getting maybe about 15% fan coverage above the hub that's actually able to potentially go over the shroud. And the air that does make it over is instantly hitting a hard drive cage, which you can also remove. And we've done these tests for you today where we've removed the hard drive cages, we've relocated the fans, just to see how much it impacts things. But just to give you an idea, out of the box, I mean, you're looking at a fan here that's blasting air straight into a metal wall, and a pretty solid one at that because it's a hard drive cage. So you remove that, and if you do, it's still blowing air basically only at the GPU. The bottom fan is blowing some air at the GPU, and then a whole bunch into where the cables are. And those cables in that chamber are not getting hot. They're not doing anything. They're not connected to anything. Maybe an SSD, so a couple of watts load, and on a cable that can withstand many more watts than that. So the fan's just not doing anything, and stock should probably be relocated, and you'll see why in our thermal section. But it'll hit the GPU a little bit, and that's kind of beneficial. It's just there's nothing really going to the CPU here, and that's a design oversight, something that seems to be a trend for Thermaltake for this week of case reviews, unfortunately. Separate from that, to give some positive notes here, build quality on these panels is very high. I mean, this is extremely sturdy construction. It's thick aluminum on the front and the top. It looks nice, and I mean, it's expensive material, and it does feel like it, and that's good because it's a $250 case. So if aluminum is your thing, this has it. It's just there are other aspects of the case, of course, that need to deliver as well, and that's what we'll look at. So let's get into the build notes, the thermals, the noise, and then see if this thing's worth $250 when it has so much competition in the market today. The side panels are hinged and secured at the front with both magnets and large rotating latches. The latches can be fairly stiff and difficult to operate without a screwdriver, but they're also only really necessary for transport, since the magnets are plenty strong enough to hold the doors shut otherwise. They're also knurled so that it is possible to unscrew them by hand, unlike similar latches made by Cooler Master that we've criticized in the past. The doors lift off of their hinges, and the hinge pins are of uneven length, which is actually good because it's very helpful for guiding them back into place, as we've mentioned in past reviews. It's just a small attention to detail that Thermaltake's done well with. The hinges are thick and strongly attached to the glass panels, which are impressively well aligned with the edges of the case, despite most of the weight being unsupported. So it lines up well, as you'll see in our B-roll shots. Since the panels aren't screwed directly onto the chassis, they have to be aligned entirely by the placement of the hinges, and tolerances are tight, but well executed. The A500 is a heavy case that feels sturdy. The top, front, and to some extent the bottom of the case are covered with plates of 3mm thick aluminum, and the sides with 4mm thick tempered glass. Both the front and top panels snap into place with plastic ball and cup fasteners, which is one of the more thoughtful and easy to use designs that we've seen, although the pieces are interdependent. The side panels should be opened to more easily remove the front panel, and the front panel should be removed to get the top panel back off. Underneath the top panel, there are several mounting points for fans, but no removable fan tray, which is a feature that we'd like to see in higher-end cases like this, and one we've seen more popularly showing up this year. The nature of the glued-in filters means that they can't be removed without permanently altering the case, so typical top exhaust configurations will be slightly hampered by the unnecessary obstruction and dust buildup. Top radiator mounting is extremely straightforward in this case. The mounting rails are 360mm long and 5 centimeters above the top edge of the motherboard, so there's plenty of space for any reasonable closed-loop liquid cooler. The front mount is nearly the same, but radiators mounted inside the chassis must share space with the hard drive cages, so placing a 360mm radiator in the front of the case removes all 3.5-inch drive support. The stock arrangement of fans, hard drive cages, and filters at the front of the case is suboptimal. The least serious issue is the hard drive cages, which can be removed or repositioned completely along a rail at the front, similar again to some cases we've reviewed recently. The stock configuration with 2 cages installed behind the intake fans is bad for thermal performance, but it makes more sense to ship the cages pre-installed rather than loose, and they're easy enough to move around and remove that this doesn't really count as a strike against Thermaltake. This led to some extra testing in the thermal section as we tried to find the optimal case configuration by removing cages and shifting fans around. Many of the cases we reviewed don't support more than 2 3.5-inch drive cages, and having some extra hard drive cages on hand is more positive than negative anyway. It's kind of the opposite of the DLC approach we've seen from other manufacturers. The 2 stock intake fans are both positioned as low as possible on the front of the case so that both of them are pointed more towards the power supply shroud and GPU rather than the CPU, to a point that it's a fault, because there's really no reason to push that much air into the power supply shroud, especially if it's breathing from the outside. This, especially if combined with those hard drive cages, makes it unlikely that cool air will find its way up to the top of the case where you might have a CPU cooler or closed loop cooler mounted. The 3 120mm case fans all spin at 1000 RPM max, which really isn't enough to effectively pull air in through the mesh strips along either side of the front panel, although there's also an unfiltered hole on the bottom. Both side panels are transparent, so cable management needs to be good, which it actually is. There are Velcro straps screwed into the chassis in a line that can handle the bulk of power and I/O cables. There's 3 centimeters of space between the glass side panel and the chassis across its entire width, so there's no need for a special cable management channel. Compare that to a more typical 1.5 centimeter gap in the level 20 MT, and it's clear just how much space that is. It's also reasonable to remove the hard drive cage underneath the shroud for extra cable space, since there are 4 3.5-inch sleds that can be mounted above the shroud. Yes, there is a vertical GPU mount, but no, we didn't test it this time. We don't recommend mounting air-cooled cards up against unventilated glass panels, and we've already proven that it's a bad idea at least 20 times this year. It should be fine for liquid-cooled cards, and Thermaltake has put a little more effort into their implementation than most by including a removable mounting plate for PCIe riser cable, but this is, again, really something you need to use with an open-loop cooling card. Thermal testing for the A500 was exhaustive for this one, and exhausting. It included a total of 5 configurations alongside all of the other cases we normally show, and those 5 are just for the A500. Our testing configurations focused first on the stock A500 enclosure, then aimed to improve performance to reach full potential by modifying the stock setup. Test variations offer a look at performance without any hard drive cages obstructing intake, a test with the front fans shifted up for more balanced airflow, a test with fans moved up and the hard drive cages removed, and then a standardized test with the front panel removed. Let's get a CPU torture chart on the screen first to look at thermal performance of the Thermaltake A500 case only against itself. We'll add comparative data in the next chart. Stock, the case didn't do too well. It's at about 68 degrees Celsius over ambient for CPU torture thermals. We postulated that most of this poor performance was to blame on the fan positioning. If you look at where they are, it sort of makes sense. Nothing really straight lines up with the CPU cooler. So we shifted the fans upwards for balance. This brought thermals down to 57.7 degrees Celsius over ambient, with idle temperature also dropped to 7 degrees from an impressively high 9.5 degrees over ambient. Not impressive in a good way, by the way. Removing the hard drive cages but keeping the stock fan configuration put us at 63 degrees over ambient, enabling a noteworthy performance improvement just by removing unused hard drive cages. We like that Thermaltake includes them with this case, so we'll just note that you should pull them out if they have no immediate use. Moving the fans up and removing the hard drive cages doesn't do as much, since it also moves the airflow path above the cages. We end up at 56 degrees over ambient with this setup. Removing the front panel entirely and leaving the fan configuration and drive stock, we end up measuring a CPU temperature of 55.6 degrees over ambient, about the same as the previous measurement and within margin of error. Comparatively, with just the stock and best case configuration on the chart, that puts the A500 near the LANCool 1 when in its stock configuration, both within margin of error of each other. The NZXT S340 Elite is similar in performance to the modified A500. Thermaltake's View 71 in stock configuration outperforms the modified A500 by roughly 1 degree Celsius, which is a massive improvement over the stock A500 performance of 68 degrees. The Dark Base Pro 900 is priced about the same and ends up near the A500 in performance, just for comparison by price point. The Cooler Master H500M also deserves a highlight here and thermally decimates the A500 while costing the same. The A500 in stock configuration is between the ENSO and the Walmart DTW, which is impressively poor performance. This speaks to limitations of fan positioning, the front panel, the hard drive cage obstructions, and overall design. Fortunately, 2 of these things are easily resolved as illustrated with the modified result. If you're willing to remove the drive cages, and you probably are, most people don't have that many these days, and you're willing to move the fans up, and you probably are, or to add a fan, the A500 does fine. It's not impressive, not for $250, it's not impressive, or $100, but whatever, but it's fine. It's about average, no better, no worse, just don't keep it in full stock configuration. If you're adding closed loop or open loop coolers, those obviously will overcome many of the limitations, but it's by brute force. And if you put those same parts in one of these other cases, they'll still perform better. It's just that if you really want the look, yes, you can brute force the performance and then you get the look. Moving on to GPU torture and starting first with just the A500, the stock configuration does better this time around. Stock performance measures 52 degrees over ambient for the GPU diode, significantly better than CPU performance as a result of the fan positioning pointing straight at the GPU. Removing the front panel is the only means we improved performance over stock. planting the A500 at 49 degrees over ambient. That just shows that the front panel isn't as massive an inhibitor to GPU thermals, at least as it was with CPU, where we don't have any static pressure up there at all, and that's because, again, both front fans are blasting the GPU with air. Removing the hard drive cages doesn't impact performance here. We're within error margins, so the results are functionally the same. Removing the cages and moving the fans up posts a temperature increase of about 6 degrees over stock. This is a better balance than the stock configuration, we think, but CPU temperature drops significantly with this layout as well. GPU impact isn't nearly as large, so if you want to run relatively stock, we'd recommend this layout. Just moving the fans increases GPU temperature the most, as expected, because we now have obstructions and less direct airflow to the GPU. Comparatively, the A500 stock configuration is about tied with the H500P mesh, a case which does reasonably well in GPU thermals and very well in CPU thermals. In fact, if you're going for thermals and a similarly sized case, we'd just recommend the H500P mesh over the A500. It's about $100 to $150 cheaper, depending on when you buy it, and has a more balanced thermal performance for both CPU and GPU components. The View 71 is about 1 degree ahead of the A500, just for another Thermaltake reference point. It's really not bad, just imbalanced to favor GPU thermals, and even those are average. At $250 for the A500, we should also highlight the Cooler Master H500M mesh at 49 degrees, which costs about the same and is also significantly more balanced for thermals. 3D Mark testing is next, so this is basically a gaming benchmark. So if that's all you do, this is what you want to look at. The Thermaltake A500 ends up around where the View 71 sits, roughly at 54 degrees over ambient for the GPU. That said, if you take a look at CPU thermals, you'll notice that the A500 runs about 10 degrees hotter. The Cooler Master H500M mesh runs at about 52 degrees over ambient for the GPU, not a huge change, but the CPU runs at 22 degrees, which is a huge change. Overall, gaming workload performance is represented well by 3D Mark, and the results are overall average for the A500. Blender render testing on just the CPU reduces the overall heat generation inside of the case, instead only running the CPU at maximum load. The GPU is not really doing much. This is a realistic load and a common use case, but one which stresses the A500 more than most as a result of its already detailed CPU cooling problem. The A500 operates at around 42 degrees over ambient for the CPU. It's fine. It's not going to cause any damage, but it's still nearly the worst on the chart. The only cases worse than this are the Bitphoenix Enso, which has literally 0 holes in the front panel, the $50 Spec 04 that Newegg recently struggled to give away, and the Walmart DTW case, which, well, you know. For GPU thermals with Blender, the A500 ends up a bit above average. The GPU does well with a 25.6 degree result, tying with the H500P mesh, the H700, and the Silent Base 601. But the CPU result is hotter than most. Considering the CPU isn't really doing anything other than scheduling the GPU here, its performance is unimpressive to say the least. And finally, noise levels allow the A500 to be partially vindicated after its embarrassing performance in the thermal section. The A500 ends up at about 35.1 dBA, right around the Bitphoenix Shogun, the Darkbase Pro 900, and better than the Cooler Master H500M 40.7 dBA result, although it's also better in cooling, so it's a trade-off. Still, as we recently showed in our airflow versus silence testing, having better airflow means that you can reduce fan noise to a point that you reach equivalent noise levels with a quieter case. Either way, the A500 at least does decently in noise, but this does teach us that its biggest inhibitors are first its fans and their static pressure, and then its fan positioning and obstructions. The answer to is it worth $250 is, as it often is, it depends. And in general, that answer is probably no, but if you really like the look, then there's not much getting around that. You can make this case work. Just expect to either spend some extra on fans, maybe you're going with open loop or closed loop cooling. In that case, you brute force your way to success. Going open or closed loop in a non-performance binding scenario where you're not blasting overclocks, you'll be fine. The water will make up for any inhibitions in the front panel, any obstructions in the hard drive cages, all that stuff. Even if you fill the hard drive cages, which would be actually very bad for thermals, but even if you do, going with water cooling will make up for a lot of that. So that's a point where if you like the look and you're doing liquid, then it'll work. It's not gonna be the best, but it will work. And it's hard to account for looks if that's really what you have your heart set on. If that's not something you care tremendously about, there is better competition from Cooler Master's H500M, which was a significant recovery from the H500P. And the H500M, we'll note, has some kind of embellishments on it that really aren't all that special. So if you wanted to save a whole lot of money, you could get the H500P mesh for a similar look. It's just that it's white and it doesn't have that full glass cover that the H500M has. Now, once you put the glass cover on, performance isn't so great. It's much better with the mesh front, but it looks pretty good. So that's good competition. It's got ARGB features. It's fine. It's superior to this in many categories. It's just that it doesn't look the same, and there's not anything else you can do about that, if that's what you care about. Other competition, Dark Base Pro 900. We'd encourage looking at that one as well. It is superior in a few categories. It's huge. It is pretty much fully modular in that you can invert the case, although it's a real pain in the ass to do it, but you could do it. And it's unique, but it's a very different case in the design sense of what it's trying to achieve. So it just comes down to, do you like the way this looks? And if the answer is anything except for I don't want anything else except for this case next to my computer, then you shouldn't buy it. If that's the answer, there's not much else you can get. So the Phanteks Evolv X is probably about the closest in overall style to this one, and that's about $200 if you don't buy the Mini ITX kit. And it's really not a terrible case. Once you go to the $400 price point, it's kind of rough in a few ways, but that would be worthwhile competition to consider as well, and we have a review on that if you care. So that's it for this one. Pretty disappointed in these last two Thermaltake cases. Thermaltake has, speaking of disappointment, I guess I've got the right shirt on for it, although it's gone, so you can't buy any, sorry. They're sold out, but Thermaltake has some really good ideas here, and they did with the level 20 as well. So like, the company is capable of doing good things and making good products. It's just, they seem to consistently, in the last two cases, screw up on really small, really obvious things. Like, for example, putting a dust filter in front of the fans, not next to them. That's an obvious thing. It's a big thing to screw up, but it's such a small, basic concept to get right in designing a case that you almost overlook it as a reviewer, because who would do that? Apparently it's Thermaltake. And a good case that Thermaltake makes would be something like the Core P3. Extremely unique, very usable in different environments. You have it standing up as a test bench or just a normal system. You can have it as a flat test bench. You can mount it to a wall. That's a cool case. And Thermaltake did that well. But then you look at stuff like this or the level 20 MT, and it seems like it's completely reversed from the products they do well. And it might be different people, different teams. I don't know. My understanding is that HQ more or less is in charge of the designs, and we're still trying to talk to someone at HQ who does the designs, because a lot of these other companies, we get the opportunity to speak to PMs and case designers and try and understand why do they do the things they do. And with Thermaltake, it's one of the few companies where we're left in the dark as reviewers as to why do you make these decisions? Is there a good reason to make some of these weird decisions that you've made? And there might be, but until they tell us, we're never gonna know. So it's just a lot of big oversights on things that seem small in terms of the level of complexity or the level of comprehension it requires to understand that thing that is being overseen. Like, again, filters in front of the fans or having a bit more of a gap for air to come through. You can still have all of these design elements visually that Thermaltake has without just completely sacrificing performance or the value proposition in some instances. $250 is a lot of money. And at that price point for a computer case, the cost of a CPU or a GPU, you really can't afford to make the kinds of mistakes that Thermaltake has been making for the last couple of cases. It's too much money to make mistakes. You can't get away with it. The users won't have it. If you're selling a $50 case, you can get away with a whole lot of mistakes. But that's not what this is. So anyway, subscribe for more. Hopefully, Thermaltake will have some better stuff for us to see at CES. We'll be there soon. If you're subscribed, you'll see that coverage. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt, not like this one because it's sold out, but we're probably going to reintroduce just the front of this design and get rid of the 2018 part on the back because it won't be 2018 anymore. So thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.